I'm going to stop this real quick. Start it again. So today, what we are going to be looking at is the last lesson of Reconstruction. The last part that we focus on is how Reconstruction kind of wraps up towards the later years from kind of the later 1860s into the 1870s. In the last unit, or sorry, in the last lesson, we talked a lot about how the assassination of Abraham Lincoln led to a lot of changes because the president at the time, Andrew Johnson, was maybe a little bit more sympathetic to the Southerners and a little bit not as protective of the formerly enslaved people. And what that does is it leads to him getting impeached and his popularity falling, and then the Republicans who are in control becoming a little bit more forceful in Reconstruction, which leads to this radical Reconstruction in 1867. And what we're going to see now is how we go from Reconstruction as a very forceful issue in the South, controlling the ways that Southern society is run, and then also really doing a good job of supporting African Americans' rights in the South. And what we're going to see in this lesson is things start to loosen in terms of Reconstruction's ability to shape Southern society, and then also Reconstruction's ability to protect African Americans in the South, both physically and in their civil rights and just their rights as human beings. So we're going to start with just a little snapshot of how freedom does affect these newly freed slaves. Former slaves began leaving plantations. African Americans now could legally marry and legally raise families. You have to remember that before the Civil War, neither of those things were possible. African Americans were not treated as citizens or even human beings in most cases. So if they were married, it was more of a ceremony, not a legal thing. And they could be separated from one another at any moment. Children were often taken from them and sold to other plantations. So these things were not available to them before the Civil War. African Americans could now go out and earn a living, but many of them faced difficulties in the lack of education. There were no schools on plantations when slavery existed. So they could not read or write. And we talked last lesson about those, the Freedmen's Bureau's introduction of schools, where grandparents and grandchildren would often be sitting in the same schoolroom, learning to read or write just to have a better opportunity in terms of their education and job opportunities. By 1869, more than 150,000 African Americans attended over 3,000 schools in the South. Most of these schools were affected by people who did not support them. Racists would, in some parts of the South, would kill teachers and burn schools just for trying to give African Americans education that they deserved. As the war ends, some people try to map out a plan that would be kind of a successful model of what we could do for African Americans once they were not enslaved any longer. General Sherman, he was the guy that marched from Atlanta to the sea, burning everything, Sherman's March. He said that most of the land that was abandoned in the coastal area of the South, because a lot of the fighting or a lot of the plantations had gone under, could be split up into 40-acre plots of land and given to African Americans. He also had a bunch of extra farm livestock. He was willing to loan. And this kind of is where that idea of 40 acres and a mule starts to pop up, like where this is one of those Civil War kind of staple things that people talk about, where maybe we were, as a United States of America, we're going to give African Americans 40 acres and a mule. This never really gets to Congress. It never becomes a focus of like, we're going to pass this law. But it does show that there are some people that are thinking about what is going to happen to enslaved people after the war. Most former slaves became sharecroppers or contract farmers. Sharecroppers basically set up a system where they work for a landowner and they get a share of the crop that they grew. Now, if you just think about this, on one end before the war, you have African Americans working on plantations for a landowner for no wages. So a slave is somebody that works on the land for the landowner and they get nothing out of the equation. A sharecropper, in an ideal situation, you work the land for the landowner and you get a fair wage or a fair part of the profit. Unfortunately, most of the time, these sharecroppers did not get very high wages. They were often cheated on the price because people that are buying this stuff, or the landowners themselves, are racist and they still believe that slavery should exist. And what this does is it keeps most African Americans in poverty. And the only real positive here is that you cannot be then sold off into another plantation. You are in control of your own body and your own labor. You are not, and your own family. You are not going to be sold off at the will of the landowner. So if we look at these images about sharecropping, so, this image right here does not look a lot different than what a plantation would have looked like with slaves working on it. These are all African Americans working the land. They are now working as sharecroppers, so they get a portion of the profit. But a lot of times what we see is this kind of cycle of poverty that would exist. So in this first picture right here, you see the farm owner provides land, the seed, the fertilizer, the tools, and other supplies, basically on a credit or a loan. So let's say it costs $300 for all of that stuff. At the end of the harvest season, the sharecropper would have to pay that back. Well, most of the time, what would happen is the sharecropper would promise part of the harvest to the owner. So then they would split the harvest. You would go and you'd sell it, and then some of that money would go to the sharecropper. Some of that money would go to the landowner. A lot of times, if the harvest was poor, the sharecroppers could not pay back the loan for the equipment, for the seed, and all of those things. And then the sharecropper has to then promise a larger part of the harvest, which leaves them with less money. And then they are left again having to ask for another loan, which ultimately they will not be able to pay back unless they offer a more substantial part of the harvest. So they are never getting ahead, essentially, in this circle. They are never, no one in this process is making money except for the landowner, which is the same situation as slavery with slight modifications. So something to think about, something that definitely affects African Americans for decades after Reconstruction. Another thing that is going to happen during this Reconstruction era is just there's going to be a lot of violent racism in the South, because as African Americans start to assert themselves in Southern society, both politically, economically, just on an everyday kind of basis, most former Confederate soldiers and planters did not want this to take place. They didn't want African Americans to have equal rights. And in 1866, racists started a terrorist group known as the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, which you probably are familiar with and have heard a little bit about. Some of the goals of the Ku Klux Klan is that they want to restore the Democratic control of the South, because right now the Democrats do not have power in the South. It is mostly Republicans. that have won elections in the South, and they want to keep former slaves from gaining economic or political power. So essentially, they just want to destroy any way of life that African Americans have. The Klan attacked African Americans and anybody that supported African Americans. So white Republicans were often a target as well. They rode on horses, dressed in robes and hoods. They beat and tortured people. They burned black schools, churches, and homes. They often would lynch their victims, which is basically a public display of torture and brutality, and essentially would kill them out in the open. Military leaders that were appointed by Andrew Johnson at the time did little to stop this, and did little to kind of reel in the violence caused by the Ku Klux Klan. And mainly this is just because most of those people that he appointed were against Reconstruction in the first place. If you remember back to the last lesson, I did talk about how Andrew Johnson was a former slave owner, quite clearly a racist, and a lot of the people that he appoints have the same issues. So if you look at, Ku Klux Klan is just kind of, they are siding with those Southern Confederates to essentially keep African Americans down, or in their, as they would say, maybe in their place, which they see as below them. This is something that is not going to be resolved very well, obviously, by Andrew Johnson. But in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant is elected president, and in the popular vote, Grant only receives 305,000 votes, but he gains a vast majority of the Electoral College votes because the northern states have more population, so they have more Electoral College votes. That leads him to a pretty easy victory over the Democratic candidates. 500,000 African Americans voted for the first time, despite a lot of the violence against African Americans and a lot of the intimidation tactics that the Ku Klux Klan would use to try to keep African Americans from voting. Ulysses S. Grant is definitely more... he is more geared towards, we need to stop the things that are going on in the South as far as the mistreatment of African Americans. And one of these things that he and Congress at the time do is that they fear that Southern states later in history might decide they're going to keep African Americans from voting in future elections, which they do. So radical Republicans propose the 15th Amendment, and this is the last amendment that we talk about in terms of the Civil War Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th banned slavery, 14th grants citizenship to all people born in the United States, and then the 15th grants voting rights. It stated that citizens could not be stopped from voting on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Glaring things that were wrong with the 15th Amendment is it does not include Native Americans or women. Both of those groups will have to wait some time to gain the right to vote. So this is just talking about African American males in the 15th Amendment. Ulysses S. Grant, again, definitely tries to go against the Ku Klux Klan. Again, he is a former military commander, so he has a very military mindset towards this. The Klan continued to terrorize the South, try to stop African Americans from voting, holding office, gaining wealth, anything like that. Grant proposed laws against the Klan to stop the violence. Congress passed these laws, and thousands of Klansmen were arrested. As a result, attacks by the Ku Klux Klan definitely decline in the 1870s. They don't go away, and they definitely will gear up once again going decades into the future. And, the Ku Klux Klan is still around today, just maybe not in such a visible, accepted way. As a result, these attacks do decline, and the election of 1872 does go smoothly. No stopping people from voting as much and those different things. And Grant does win re-election. But Grant, especially in his second term, has problems, some scandals in his presidency. Ulysses S. Grant, if you need to see a picture of him, this is him right here. This image down here kind of represents the 15th Amendment. So Ulysses S. Grant kind of puts down the Ku Klux Klan and also supports the 15th Amendment. Those are some of his highlights of his presidential terms. Some of the problems are that he doesn't pick the best people to be around him in terms of advisors. Mostly he picks friends. He picks army friends. He picks his wife's relatives. He doesn't necessarily pick the best minds of the time. Many were unqualified. They started wanting, instead of wanting the country to succeed, they started to take bribes. And these bribes that they took, like basically money, they would accept money. In turn, they would do whatever that person that was giving them money, they would pass a law, or they would change something or help that person out. This caused several scandals which weakened the Republican Party. So at this point, the Republican Party has been very successful through the Civil War, after the Civil War. Now what we see is the Republican Party is divided on whether or not to support Grant in these scandals and these public issues that he's having, and the Republican Party splits. As a result, the Republicans are not as powerful, because if you have one unified group moving forward, all of you can vote in the same way. If it's split, now things get a little bit more difficult, and the Democrats, who want less Reconstruction laws, can be more successful. As a result, the Republicans were unable to impose the tougher Reconstruction policies. And this is where we really start to see a slip in the Reconstruction laws and the protections for African Americans in the South. During this time, there is also something else that weakens the Republican Party, and that is that the economy goes into a depression. Essentially what happens is you have banks run out of money. People take their money out of the banks, which causes even more banks to run out of money. Those banks close. The stock market collapses. That's where you get a depression. This lasted for 5 years. 18,000 companies closed in the United States during this 5-year period, and 500,000 workers became unemployed. This, anytime that there is economic success, most of the time, the party that is in power gets the credit. And anytime that there is failure in the economy, the party that is in power gets the blame. Right or wrong, that's just really how it is. If you are in a position of power, you're out in front of people, and things are going good, you get the credit. If things are going bad, you typically will get the blame. So people blame the Republicans. They are in power at the time, and this allows the Democrats to gain power and gain seats in Congress in the election of 1874. Americans also are starting to grow a little tired of hearing about Reconstruction. So a lot of them are like, can't we just be done with this? Can't we just let the South do whatever they want to do in terms of Reconstruction? We're just we're sick of hearing about all this other stuff. We've got problems in the North. We've got problems ourselves. We don't want to keep hearing about the South and Reconstruction. We just want it to kind of be over. So interest is going away in rebuilding the South in that radical Reconstruction model. And also interest is going away in the problems of African Americans as well. All of these things together are going to lead to civil rights for African Americans being reversed. So the freedoms and the rights they had directly after the Civil War start to get taken away from them during this time frame in the 1870s because of some Supreme Court cases and some other things. So the Supreme Court undid some of the progress made by Congress in terms of civil rights. The court ruled U.S. versus Kershank, that the federal government could not punish individuals who violated the civil rights of African Americans, which is just an insane thing to think about. Is that the law here is that if you keep a person from voting, you can't be punished. If you keep them from having access to their rights or freedom, you can't be punished. That's what the decision is, which really just is kind of a slap in the face to African Americans. It was a power that the states had to take care of. And if you're living in some of these Southern Confederate states, the states don't care if you stop African Americans from voting, so they're not going to punish you. If the federal government can't do it, no one's going to do it. So it really sets up a system where the states can suppress the rights of African Americans without any sort of repercussion. In U.S. versus Reese in 1876, they ruled that the 15th Amendment did not give everyone the right to vote. The states could prevent African Americans from voting if they put other reasons on it. So many southern states imposed poll taxes, which means that you had to pay to vote. But we've already covered the fact that many African Americans after the Civil War were living in poverty. They were sharecroppers. They didn't have money. They didn't have money to spend on a lot of things, let alone money to spend on voting. They also had literacy tests, which would block African Americans from voting and block them from doing different things. And we've also talked about the fact that African Americans that were enslaved didn't have access to education. And now after the Civil War, if they have access to education, a lot of times their teachers are being killed or their schools are being burned down. So if you have to go and show up and be able to pass a test that is created by the people that don't want you to vote in the first place, you probably are not going to be able to pass that test, and then you can't vote. And these were laws that existed that were okay because of these Supreme Court cases. Let me just look here at some of these images. They're also talking about, in this portion of your book, Jim Crow laws. This is going to be kind of later, after 1877, so after the official end of Reconstruction, but I did want to mention it a little bit. Segregation is where you separate races. So if you've ever seen pictures from the 1950s and 60s in the civil rights movement, where you would have different entrances for black and white people at restaurants or different water fountains or different schools or anything along those lines. That is segregation. In the South, they passed Jim Crow laws, which essentially mandated that they must be kept separate. Whites and blacks must be kept separate from each other in schools, restaurants, theaters, trains, streetcars, playgrounds, hospitals, and even cemeteries. Now, do you think that it's reasonable to believe that all of those things are going to be, so the white train car is going to be the exact same as the black train car, or the black school is going to be the same as the white school, or the hospital is going to be the same? Mostly, no. It is never going to be equal, because attention is not going to be paid to building those African Americans facilities as well as those white facilities. So these things come up, and later on, closer to the 1900s, there is Plessy versus Ferguson, which is another Supreme Court case that does a lot to suppress African Americans' ability to have equal treatment under the law. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation was legal as long as the facilities for blacks and whites were equal. So basically what they're saying is it's separate but equal. So it's like your parents saying, yes, both of you, you and your sibling are going to get new cars. you're not going to share it. You're each going to have different modes of transportation, not even cars. You don't have to share it, but each of you get something, so it's fine. It's equal. Each of you have some way to get from point A to point B. Well, your sibling gets a brand new car that costs $50,000, and you get a Little Tykes tricycle. Like, that's not equal. Just because you're saying that you get the same thing, you get a mode of transportation, doesn't mean that it's equal. So that's essentially what is happening in most of these Jim Crow situations. Whites would have the brand new car, and African Americans would be provided with something supremely inferior that caused their. If it is separate, it is inherently unequal, and that's what we'll get to in the 1950s and the 1960s. But it takes 70 years to get there, and a lot of those problems still exist today in parts of the country. So the end of Reconstruction came in 1876. The Democrats chose Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes ran against each other. The results are very disputed. The results in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida were so close that both sides claimed victory. The results were so close that it forced the parties to compromise, and this is called the Compromise of 1877. So if you look at this map here real quick, you can see that in these pie charts that the Samuel Tilden has more of the popular vote than Rutherford B. Hayes, but in the Electoral College, it is so close, and that is excluding all of these disputed results. So what they do is they come up with a compromise to settle this, and what the Compromise of 1877 says is that Republicans would get the presidency, so Rutherford B. Hayes would become president if they agreed to do a few things. The government had to remove federal troops from the South. The government would provide land and loans to build roads to link the South and the West Coast. Hayes would appoint a Democrat to his cabinet, so his group of advisors, like the top people in the government. And the Democrats promised, in quotation marks, I'm doing air quotes, to respect African-American rights. So a lot of times the Compromise of 1877 is known as the Great Betrayal. And what that means is that for 10 years after the Civil War, the northern states and African Americans worked together to try to build African American rights and try to build a society in the South that could be equal for whites and blacks. With the Compromise of 1877, essentially all of that is just like, well, we tried. It doesn't work anymore. So we're just going to let the South do what the South is going to do. So if you look at this picture, some of the details in it, you can see that the Northern soldier and like the Lady Liberty they have their head down, they're crying, and the Southern soldier is very proud, and he is actually stomping on the grave of Union soldiers. So essentially what this cartoon is saying is that the Compromise of 1877 undid all of the work and all of the death and all of the sacrifice that the Civil War and the Union soldiers that died for a cause. It basically has undone all of that, because now you don't have a force in the South to stop Southern states from discriminating against African Americans. Before, you had troops there that could uphold these new laws and uphold these rights. And now they're gone, and it becomes less of an issue. people are tired of dealing with it, so they just kind of let the South do what they're going to do. Reconstruction changes the United States. Slavery is over, and African Americans gained many new rights. However, the federal government failed to protect these rights, and they are there. They have them in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but African Americans can do nothing to access those rights if the states that they're living in do not want them to have them. Reconstruction does not by any means fix the problems of inequality in the South, and much more work would need to be done. And what you'll see is in the next 80, 90, 100 years of history, that work is done by civil rights leaders in the 50s and 60s, like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, those people. So this is just something that I got off of Khan Academy, of just kind of the failures of Reconstruction. So after Reconstruction, African Americans did have new rights. They owned their bodies and they owned their labor, like I mentioned earlier. But that was about it. They could not go and do things freely. They could not go and vote. They could not go and have economic success easily any longer. It was very short-lived. 10 years of revolutions in citizenship, voting rights, getting African Americans in Congress. But then after the Compromise of 1877, all of that kind of goes away. However, it does, these amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, do lay the foundation for that civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. So there are some successes, but Reconstruction does not go nearly far enough to have lasting change for African Americans throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. It takes until the middle of the 1500s, the middle of the 1900s to actually even be a focus of topic again. So that's it for this lesson. That's it for the unit. That's it for the year, I guess. Make sure that you are